Hey y'all, I got cut off with about a page and a half left. So we're starting here on Although the Private, and then we'll lead into chapter 5. Chapter 5 is very long, so it's going to be in two different videos. So y'all pay attention to that when it's on the HyperDoc, okay? All right. Although the Private had been chosen to be part of the Corps of Discovery, the captains decided not to keep him in the permanent party of explorers. The following spring, when the smaller groups returned home with the captain's notes and samples, the deserter would be sent back. This expedition was too dangerous and too important to take along a man who could not be trusted. Another problem had developed, and this one was even worse than the private's desertion. Sergeant Charles Floyd had horrible pains in his stomach, and he could not hold down food. The pain grew worse, so Lewis made him a bed inside a cabin of a keelboat, and York helped watch over the sick man. Sweat poured off Floyd's forehead as he clutched his stomach. Seaman stretched out on the floor beside the sergeant's bed. When the sergeant moaned, Seaman licked the man's face. Lewis had studied treatments for the common ailments before the expedition began. He had talked with doctors about medicines to take on the trip, but none of the pills seemed to help the sergeant. Floyd's pain kept getting worse. On August 20th, Floyd died. He was 22 years old. Lewis did not know what the cause of the young man's death. The captain only felt great sadness that he was unable to cure this patient. My dogs are barking. Sorry about that. The corpse held a funeral service for Sergeant Floyd on a hill overlooking a river. Seamen sat quietly, watching the men's somber faces as they said farewell to Floyd. Each of the men wondered how many would die before they reached the Pacific Ocean. Perhaps not a one of them would live to tell about their journey. As they prayed for Floyd, they also prayed for safe passage through the perils that they would face. In Floyd's honor, the captains named the place Sergeant Floyd's Bluff. The expedition kept moving up the Missouri River, but the mood of the explorers had darkened. After the men went to sleep at night, the captains would stay up to take latitude and longitude readings. They talked as they worked. "We've had two major problems with our men this month, a deserter and a death," Lewis said, his face grim. Seaman padded over to Lewis and flopped down noisily beside him. He nuzzled Lewis's hand. "Just 1 month ago, everything seemed perfect. What will go wrong next?" Clark stared at the sky. "We're coming into Sioux territory, Meriwether. We only had 50 men, and now one of our sergeants is dead. I'm worried. The Sioux are a powerful collection of tribes. I've heard trappers say to the other Indian tribes are terrified of them." Clark frowned and stood up. "I guess there's no point in guessing how the Sioux will greet our Corps of Discovery. We're sure to run into them soon. Then we'll find out." Chapter 5. Sioux Territory. August 27th through October 1804. On the 27th of August, as the boats passed the mouth of the James River, an Indian boy swam over to one of the pirogues. Y'all are just going to have to laugh every time that word comes up now. Yell at me through the computer. Some of the men could speak a few words of the teenager's language, and the others knew sign language. Soon enough, the explorers understood that the boy was a Yankton Sioux. The captains asked him to bring one of the tribes to a meeting. At last, the Corps of Discovery was about to come face to face with the mighty Sioux. The meeting took place over 3 days on August 30th at the Calumet Bluffs. Again, the men wore their dress uniforms and staged a military display. Again, Captain Lewis gave a speech about the new white father and his plans for trade with the Indians. The captains passed out medals and small presents to the Yankton chiefs. The Indians dressed up for the occasion in buffalo robes and jewelry made of porcupine quills and feathers. 4 Yankton musicians played as the chiefs assembled for the meeting. After the soldiers' military display, the Yanktons staged their own display of skill and strength. They organized a competition to show off their boys' ability to shoot with bows and arrows. That evening, assembled around 3 campfires, the Indians told stories in song to the music and drums and rattles. The singers acted out great deeds and battles. Each singer had skin painted with vivid colors, leaped and swirled to make his story come alive. The explorers loved entertainment. To show their pleasure, they threw gifts to the performers: bells, small pouches of tobacco, and a few knives. Even the captains were impressed with the Yanktons and thought them handsome and well-dressed. Unlike the men, Seaman did not relax during the party. He was nervous around so many strangers, their unfamiliar smells, movements, and sounds. He padded restlessly around the merry camp, his ears alert and his eyes watching closely. He never growled at the Yanktons, but he avoided their touch. He settled down beside Lewis for a few minutes and moved to sit near Clark and Coulter or another of the men. While the braves danced, Seaman wandered over to York and sat down. The Indians were especially interested in York because of his dark skin. They swirled close to him, inviting him to join their dance. York laughed and clapped his hands to the music. At one point he leaped up and danced a short jig. He tried to draw Seaman into the fun, but the dog sat stiffly and wouldn't play. The next morning, another formal meeting was held with the Indians. This time, Yankton chiefs made their speeches. The captains gave out gifts of tobacco, but the Indians were not pleased with either tobacco or medals. They wanted practical gifts, such as guns and ammunition, and they said so. Although the Yanktons were openly disappointed with the generosity of their new white father, the corps could not offer to give away vital supplies. They had a long journey ahead of them. All in all, both groups parted with mixed feelings. The meeting had been friendly and enjoyable, but not completely satisfying. Soon after the explorers said goodbye to the Yanktons, they realized that one of their men was missing. George Shannon had not returned from a hunting trip. Nobody had any reason to think that young Shannon would desert. The captains were solely worried. The evening campfires did not seem so cozy without Shannon's songs. Seamen roamed restlessly about the cabin. On August 30th, the captains sent John Coulter, an excellent tracker, to find Shannon. What had happened to the youngest man in the Corps of Discovery? Had he been captured by the Sioux? As the explorers paddled and pulled their boats upstream, they were constantly looking out for Shannon. They kept up with Coulter's progress by noting the muddy tracks he left alongside the river. The men also watched for more Indians. On the 7th of December, Lewis whistled for Seaman. He and Clark were eager to inspect the countryside. The look of the land had been changing gradually as the Missouri River left the Great Plains and moved into the northern plains. The captain walked along the river and gazed through the trees at the rolling prairie. Seaman picked up the scent of the fresh deer droppings. A herd of elk was just visible in the distance. Clark spotted ripe yellow plums growing on small trees, and the captain stopped to feast on the soft, delicious fruit. Seaman wandered into the grassy prairie and noticed a small squirrel standing on its hind legs. He sprang forward, but the squirrel seemed to vanish. Seaman twirled, looking for the quick-footed creature. It popped up a few yards away and chattered in a thin, squeaky voice. Seaman darted after it, but it disappeared again. Then, as if by magic, it popped up a few yards to the right. This time, Seaman hesitated. The little squirrel watched him. Suddenly, a second one popped up, its beady eyes alert. Then a third one stood up and made a whistling squeak. Seaman turned around and around, watching in confusion as the little creatures popped up all around him. The captains caught up, intrigued that Seaman seemed to be dancing. Lewis called Seaman and came slowly, glancing behind him at the odd little creatures that were watching him. Lewis stroked Seaman's big head. "It's all right, boy," he said, grinning. "These animals are not like squirrels back home. They seem to have escape tunnels, and they slip into their holes before you can pounce on them." Clark dropped to his knees to examine one of the holes. "I wonder how far down this tunnel goes. I can't see any sign of creature hiding in there." He stood up and shaded his eyes with his hands to see how far the collection of holes extended. Hundreds of holes stretched out over an area larger than grounds of Camp Wood. Quite an army, these little creatures out here, I'd say. I'd like to capture one of these animals and send it home to our scientists, said Lewis. I'd never seen a squirrel that makes tunnels like these. I'm going to get the men. We'll dig one up. We'll dig into one of the tunnels right now. Lewis came back, bringing shovels and a pole, as well as most of the men. They dug 6 feet through the hard clay, following one tunnel, but they didn't reach the animal. When the diggers paused to wipe the sweat off their foreheads, York stuck out a pole into the hole. Look, he said. This here hole goes further than the length of this pole. We've dug as deep as a proper grave, but we haven't even dug halfway to the end of this tunnel. Lewis ordered the men to stop digging. No use in digging up half the prairie, he snapped in frustration. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to think of another way to capture one of the squirrels. Seems we're not having any better luck than Seaman, Clark said cheerfully. What do you say we give up, Merriweather? He can just write a description in our field notes. But Lewis was determined to capture one of the creatures. He sent the man over to the river to fetch a barrel of water. They poured the water into the tunnel, expecting to wash the animal out, but that didn't work. Clark was giving up again, but Lewis refused to budge without his prey, so he sent the men back for another barrel of water. It took 5 barrels of water before one of the creatures was finally forced into the surface and captured. When he got back to camp, Lewis put the little creature in a cage in the keelboat's cabin. Some of the men said that these little squirrels were called small dogs of the prairie by French-speaking trappers, but the scientists in the United States had never heard of prairie dogs, so Lewis carefully described them in his notes. Lewis decided to join hunting parties to get a better feel for the animal life in the northern plains. He shot his first buffalo in September, on September 8th. The next day, Lewis and another man went hunting. Seaman ran through the brush next to him as they came to a bend in the river. Seaman raised his head and sniffed. The smell of matted buffalo fur and sweat was new to him. As the huge animals moved, they broke the earth with their hooves, overturning clods of grass and filling the air with the smell of fresh dirt. Seaman pranced around Lewis's legs, woofing with excitement. Lewis motioned to Seaman to stay behind. The men crept through the bush, approaching downwind of the herd so they could get close before the buffalo smelled them and stampeded. When the hunters broke into the clearing, Lewis shouted, "Get 'em, Seaman!" Seaman bounded after the heels of the galloping animals as the men aimed and fired. Lewis and the other hunters each shot a buffalo that day. Seaman ran and chased until he was exhausted. As the men quartered the meat and tied it to the poles so they could haul it back to camp, Seaman stretched out on the ground, panting. Pleased with his success as a hunter, Lewis was in a playful mood. He picked up a long stick and urged Seaman to grab a hold at the end of the game and tug of war. Seaman ignored the stick and rolled over, sprawling like a tired puppy. Lewis scratched the dog's belly. "We've had a fine day's hunting, haven't we, boy?" he said, laughing aloud. Coulter never managed to track down Shannon, but on September 11th, the mystery of the missing man was finally solved. As the keelboat rounded the bend, Seaman began to bark excitedly. The men looked puzzled. They had never heard Seaman make this sound. It was higher and louder and more insistent than his everyday barking. Suddenly, one of the men shouted, "God be praised, there's George Shannon!" The keelboat pulled up to the bank and the men surrounded Shannon. The young man seemed astonished to see the boats. He had assumptions that the corpse had traveled far ahead of him, and he had given up on trying to follow. He had lost one of the 2 horses that he had taken with him. His bullets had run out 12 days before, so he had been eating mostly fruit. His only hope was to meet some trappers who might take him back to a settlement. Shannon was very thin and weak. The men helped him aboard the keelboat, and Seaman jumped in beside him. Shannon sat down and put his arms around the dog's thick neck and leaned against him for support. Seaman sat very still, examining the young man's weary face, and the men handed Shannon some dried meat, and then he ate it gratefully as he told the story. Then he rested his head on Seaman's thick fur and fell sound asleep, sitting up. Seaman did not so much as shift his weight until Shannon awoke. And I'll see you guys in the next video.